Pythagoras is a very complex subject, and it's very difficult to cover him in a short video. So now we will focus on just a few misconceptions associated with this figure. And first of all, on the very popular idea that Pythagoras essentially created his own religious or quasi-religious sect, where he was honored as a god, and his disciples had to follow a large number of convoluted rules, keep the basic doctrines in secret, and so on and so forth. You've heard this story before, and it is not exactly true. Let's try and demystify all of this. There are several layers of misconceptions here, and actually the first is when people see Pythagoras solely as an ancient mathematician and the supposed author of the Pythagorean theorem. Apparently, half of the people who have heard the name Pythagoras don't know that his work was much broader than just math. And traditionally, he is better known as a philosopher. Some people even call him the first Greek philosopher, which is also not entirely accurate. Usually, this debatable title of the first philosopher is awarded to Thales. If people start to be interested in Pythagoras a little bit more, and then read something about him and listen to lectures, this is where you immediately have new layers of misconceptions, many layers. Right off the bat, we hear about a quasi-religious community founded by Pythagoras, a community that outlived its founder and developed his ideas. They also often credited their numerous scientific discoveries to Pythagoras, even though he was long dead by then. All of this is either completely untrue or partially untrue. And some of the facts or pseudo-facts are very debatable, and there may be several parallel mutually exclusive theories. Most of the misconceptions come from this situation when technically you have a reasonable amount of sources, but they are usually fragmentary. Secondly, Pythagoras quite quickly transformed into a legendary and practically mythical character. So he and his followers are surrounded by anecdotes of extremely disputable authenticity. Thirdly, the vast majority of all these, so to speak, juicy stories are taken from the works of authors who lived much, much later. Mostly we're talking about Neoplatonists. Neoplatonist is an invented word, but we'll talk about that some other time. To a very large extent, all these stories about Pythagoras as the bearer of esoteric knowledge, ruling a secret community of Pythagorean vegetarians, are the product of authors like Iamblichus. A bulk of the information we find in the writings of the so-called Neoplatonists is absent from the early sources. It can't be confirmed, and sometimes it actually contradicts the early sources. So it is very likely that we're dealing with the fantasies of Iamblichus and Porphyry, people who lived more or less 800 years after the death of Pythagoras. People who were engaged in turning Platonism into a religion with rituals and sacred texts like the Chaldean oracles. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the point. It is essentially Iamblichus who develops all these ideas about Pythagoras as a cult leader, about mathematicians and acousmatics, about the numerous prohibitions of the Pythagorean sect, about the vow of silence, and so on. All those interesting and mysterious things that both students and the mass audience are told. From what we know, the reality looks somewhat different. And when I say reality, I mean data from early sources. Of course, they are problematic as well. As already mentioned, the earliest sources, 6th and 5th centuries BC, are fragmentary. Pythagoras himself apparently wrote nothing, and even if he did, nothing has reached us. It appears that the first person who outlined the doctrines of Pythagoreans was Philolaus. It happened more or less 100 years after Pythagoras. Unfortunately, only small fragments of his works survived, but at least we're quite sure that, for example, Aristotle was familiar with them. But it should be understood that Philolaus is not Pythagoras. The philosophical views of each individual Pythagorean could seriously differ from the views of Pythagoras himself and from the views of other Pythagoreans. Besides, there is a point of view that we can speak about the philosophy of the Pythagoreans only starting from Philolaus and onwards. We have more sources from the 4th century BC, but obviously 2 centuries had already passed since Pythagoras' time, and Pythagoras himself was beginning to turn into a legendary figure. One of the most important sources on the early Pythagoreans is actually Aristotle. The problem is that Aristotle's accounts of the Pythagoreans and their philosophy are very peculiar. For example, he names many Pythagorean philosophers, but he does not call them Pythagoreans. And when he speaks about Pythagoreans, he does not name specific representatives of this direction, but collects their ideas in a pile and presents them as views of Pythagoreans in general. At the same time, he occasionally mentions that in general they did not have any rigid, generally accepted monolithic system. So the views of individual Pythagoreans contradicted each other. Pythagoras himself is mentioned in the works only twice. Despite such a sad state of the sources, their analysis is quite possible and historians have been actively engaged in it for at least a couple of centuries. And the views evolved significantly over time. Obviously, if we're talking about Pythagoras and early Pythagoreans, the emphasis should be on the analysis of the early sources. Unfortunately, as it was already mentioned, many people prefer to take information from late sources and just project the ideas of Neo-Pythagoreans / Neoplatonists who invented myths and legends almost a millennium later. And strictly speaking, they were neither Pythagoreans nor Platonists. So what can we say about Pythagoras, his life and his role as a cult leader? We don't know when Pythagoras was born, but the general consensus is around 570 BC. On the island of Samos. There is an alternative version about his Etruscan origins, but nobody takes it seriously. Around the age of 40, Pythagoras left his native Samos, which was under the rule of Polycrates, and moved to the city of Croton in Magna Graecia, which is South Italy. He becomes kind of famous there, and he starts his Pythagorean societies, which in time begin to play a reasonably important role in the politics of Croton and of region in general. In a way, this is where we can find the key to what the Pythagoreans of the period really were. This is not a religious community, theosos, much less a cult. But this isn't really a full-blown philosophical school like the later Stoics and Epicureans either. They were a heteria, but a very peculiar one. There was a philosophical and even religious component, but at its core it was still a heteria, a club, a community. Heteria in ancient Greece could take different forms, from just a bunch of people who get together to drink and have fun, to groups of people actively engaged in politics, something like political parties, but not exactly. Did the Pythagoreans and Pythagoras personally engage in politics? Yes. Quite possibly it was their main field of operations, so to speak. This is not inconsistent with the fact that they shared a number of common ideas and in general had a serious inclination to pursue the sciences. in the form the sciences existed in antiquity. And they were really serious about the sciences: mathematics, music, astronomy, biology, medicine, starting with Pythagoras and going on for hundreds of years. It should be noted separately that according to the evidence we have, it looks like Pythagoras is the father of theoretical mathematics, also known as pure mathematics. His followers did not stop there and continued to develop this discipline. For example, Hippasus, who lived a century after Pythagoras, apparently was the first person to discover irrational numbers. There is a popular misconception that Pythagoreans traditionally attributed all scientific discoveries to Pythagoras. Early sources do not support this view. Moreover, we know the names of the Pythagorean mathematicians and roughly what they were working on, which directly contradicts this strange idea, which obviously appeared much later. And yes, if you've been wondering which Pythagorean is actually the author of the famous Pythagorean theorem, the early sources are quite clear in attributing a very specific author. They have no disagreement on this subject. So, according to early sources, the author of the Pythagorean theorem was, drumroll, you won't believe it, but the author was Pythagoras. Who could have believed? Okay, back to the adventures of Pythagoras in Croton. Over time, Pythagoras and his community gained political influence in Croton. But of course, this didn't happen overnight. Although, of course, later tradition sometimes tells us that everyone was incredibly fascinated by Pythagoras almost the minute he stepped off the ship. We should remember that Pythagoras was a foreigner. He needed time for someone to start taking him seriously and to be allowed to participate in the political life of Croton in one way or another. We know that the Pythagoreans played a decisive role in the war with neighboring Sybaris, but that was 20 years after the arrival of Pythagoras. And shortly after the victory over Sybaris, Pythagoreans were expelled by Chilon, also known as Cylon, and his supporters. At least that's the conclusion we can draw from the sources. Pythagoras had to flee to Metapontum, and that's where he died. The Pythagorean communities did not go anywhere and existed for a long time in the south of Italy. But then they had another round of persecutions. The largest was in 454 BC in Metapontum. Some of the Pythagoreans were forced to run away to Greece. Obviously, the south of Italy of this period produced a large number of philosophers/scientists. So, as I said before, it is quite clear that although the Pythagorean communities were primarily heterogeneous, their founder quite clearly encouraged them to pursue scientific research. There is no evidence in the early sources that Pythagoreans were subject to any of the strange restrictions of which later authors really like to talk about, especially when discussing cosmetics and all these wonderful lists of Pythagorean symbols, like don't mix fire with a knife. Obviously, they had a common ethical and philosophical framework and lifestyle recommendations, so to speak. Apparently, indeed, Pythagoras actually recommended not to eat beans, fava beans in particular. But turning this recommendation into some mystical rule which should be either understood allegorically or maybe literally because it is somehow connected with the transmigration of souls. This is just stuff from the late sources and mostly fantasies of Iamblichus and other Neoplatonists. There are reports that Pythagoreans were serious about dietary prescriptions, mostly due to their interest in medical sciences and, by extension, in living a healthy life. Pythagoras clearly recommended moderation, but it is weird to call somebody a cultist if the guy just says that you probably shouldn't get drunk like a pig. In the case of this recommendation not to eat beans, there is a well-established theory that it is in fact directly connected to an actual disease or enzyme deficiency called favism, also known as G6PDD. Pythagoras may have been aware of favism in one way or another, and that is why he recommended avoiding beans. As for vegetarianism, which, as we've heard a million times, was widespread among Pythagoreans because they believed in the transmigration of souls, everything is not as simple as it may seem. Indeed, both early and late sources leave us no doubt that Pythagoreans believed in metempsychosis, transmigration of souls. But then the accounts from the early sources vary and sometimes quite significantly. For example, some say that Pythagoreans did not eat certain animals. Others say that they didn't eat certain parts of the animals. Obviously, since Pythagoreans were very involved in politics, they simply could not avoid meat. This approach would immediately raise a lot of questions from everybody around. The Greeks sacrificed animals at various state events on a regular basis, and then, of course, they ate them. In fact, all these sacrifices were, in many ways, like ritualized barbecue parties. Refusing to eat during social gatherings would have been strange and suspicious. There's even an explanation that Pythagoras was against meat in general, but the meat of sacrificial animals was considered a completely different thing, because souls do not transmigrate into sacrificial animals. There's also another very popular stereotype that this fictional cult of Pythagoras was very secretive, some full-blown secret religious society. Supposedly they were something like the Freemasons of the 6th century BC. Well, yeah, if this Pythagorean club was, to a certain extent, something that remotely resembled a political party, and even if it was, just a club, then there were some secrets there. Sure, it's natural. But don't exaggerate this component. The teachings of Pythagoras were so secret that some of the beliefs of Pythagoreans were ridiculed in ancient Greek comedy. And Philolaus, as already mentioned, wrote a book, or three, we don't know the exact number, a book on Pythagorean philosophy. And he was by no means the last Pythagorean to write anything. Very, very secretive. Let's sum this all up a little bit. Pythagoras and Pythagoreans is a very complex and very interesting subject. You need a lot of time to discuss it properly. And there are a great many misconceptions originating from very late sources, and the state of sources actually complicates the analysis. But if we're relying on the earliest accounts, we can quite confidently say that Pythagoras never was a cult leader, and Pythagoreans were not a cult in the first place. And all of the stories about strange religious restrictions, borrowing of mathematical formulas from Babylon, incredible secrecy of the society, vows of 5 year silence, and so on, all of this was blown out of proportion and based on unreliable material. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to, subscribe and stuff, and see you soon.